Good evening again, folks. It's part two. We had James Holland on 2 hours ago talking about Burma in sort of general terms, about the campaign, the nature of the fighting there, a bit of myth busting, a bit of talking about the terrain, the climate. But now we're going to go a little bit more specific now as we continue with Burma Week, and we're talking about the role of the SOE and other kind of resistance units, what have you, in Burma. And joining me, Dr. Richard Duckett from the UK, who has written an incredible book about the SOE. Good evening, Richard. How are you doing?
Good evening. I'm good, thanks.
Good. So before we get into the specifics of the role of the SOE in Burma, how did you get into studying the SOE in Burma?
Well, a bit of it goes back to my teenage years, really. The plan was always to learn German and get fluent in German and get in the German archives and start looking at things like D-Day from the German side of things. But I went to visit my elderly uncle throughout the later senior school years and into my A-levels, and he fought in Burma. He was a sapper with the 2nd Division, his 208 Field Company Royal Engineers. Also with my granddad, who I never knew because he died when my mum was about 3 years old. And one day Cliff just sort of opened up and started telling me about his experiences in Burma. And that was the inspiration, really, as the dedication in my book shows. Yeah, so I ended up not really focusing on Europe so much at all, and publishing a book on Burma and SOE.
Well, cool. And as we just established with James, that it is a long way away from everywhere, and everything studying it there, the terrain is alien to us as pasty Englanders. It's everything becomes that much harder to kind of get to grips with just the country. Forget about the actual battles and campaigns and all the military maneuvers within it. Just understanding the environment takes a bit of time. So how did you find the process of just kind of looking at something that is so the other side of the world?
Yeah, you just as you and James were saying, you've got to go to these places. You've got to go and experience it. You've got to see it. You've got to experience the heat. You've got to experience the sweatiness. Feel the jungle, hear the jungle, and get to know it. I haven't been in the jungle as much as I'd like, but I have managed to visit Burma back in 2017, which was a fantastic trip. It's hard to write about somewhere that you haven't been, I think.
Yeah, oh, definitely. That's one of the fundamental principles, I think, of writing about a battle. If you haven't been there, kind of don't try. So anyway, we're going to talk about the specific nature of the SOE in Burma, and you've given us a PowerPoint that we're going to use during this. So over to you, really, and then I will jump in with comments and when I think I've got something I want to say, but I'll hand over to you. So, ladies and gentlemen, Richard Duckett talking about the SOE in Burma.
Fantastic, thanks very much. Now, I thought I'd just do something a little bit inspired by one of the We Have Ways pods that went out the other day with Andrew Chatterton talking about the AUX units. I was really fascinated by the AUX units as a teenager. In fact, my first my undergrad dissertation was on Operation Sea Lion, and the first time I got into the archives was to go and look at all the preparations for invasion that I could lay my hands on then. So there was something that was really interesting that was said, and that was that Britain was the only country to prepare a resistance movement before it was needed. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that tonight in the context of Burma, because I thought it'd be interesting to do a bit of a comparison. If we just go to the next slide, let's just clarify a few terms.
Hang on. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's commonly referred to as Force 136, but that's what it became. That's what it matured into, and what is known as SOE from March 1944. As I said there, but originally they were known as the Oriental Mission, although that wasn't its official name either. So the decision to send a team SOE out to the Far East was first mooted in August 1940. So just a month after SOE was formed, they're talking, well, should we send them out to the Far East as well? And these plans were firmed up over the summer and getting organised, ready to go. And indeed they did in 1941. So officially it was known as the Far Eastern Mission when it went out in 1941. It's also referred to as Mission Scapula and Operation Puma. So it's got these various names. So that was SOE based in Singapore, working to the east of India. Where Force 136 comes in is in the middle of 1942 after the defeat in Burma. So originally, Colin Mackenzie set out to India to set up something called the India Mission, and his countries of responsibility were to work to the west of India, Afghanistan, Persia, and sort of that bit of Asia to the east of the Indian Empire. So that was the India Mission. And then when you got the defeat in Burma, the Oriental Mission, as the soldiers started calling it, London didn't like it being called that, apparently, according to the archives. They called it GSIK as a cover name, because of course you had to have a cover name for all these top secret organizations. And then from March 1944, it's first referred to in February in the archives. February 1944, they start talking, well, should we name it Force 136? And then it's sort of official from March 1944. So I just wanted to clarify the different names and how it amalgamated. And so officially, if we're going to talk about Force 136, it's GSIK before that. It's sort of India Mission and it's Oriental Mission, and it's weird sort of amalgamation after the war situation changed. But originally sent out to Singapore as the Far Eastern Mission, we say. Go to the next slide. What I was really excited to find was, contrary to the historiography that was in existence before my book, where they claimed in the official history, for example, that there was no charter for SOE in the Far East. Well, I managed to find a charter from the head of SOE Far Eastern Mission, Valentine St. John Killery. It's in HS 1340 for those of you who know the National Archives. And this charter sets out what I've quoted on here and a few other things. What SOE was to do based in Singapore, what the Far Eastern Mission was set out to do. So as you can see there, it says the whole political position in the Far East at the present time is extremely delicate. There's this real sense of we mustn't provoke the Japanese. We cannot cope with what will happen if we get the Japanese into the war before we're ready. We've got, well, the pictures illustrates it there for you. I love that bit from Dad's Army. And the link to the AUX units, of course. So they are going out there, but it's got to be really, really top secret because they do not want to provoke the Japanese. And although they let all the commanders, the commanders in chief of various places, the GOXNO, the general officer commanding places like Malaya, Percival, they let them know that SOE is coming. They also they've got this confusion as to, we know they're coming, we know what they want to do, but how do we do this and not provoke the Japanese? So they sort of cold shoulder SOE, and Killery doesn't get very far. So this is why the Oriental Mission's got this this reputation of having not achieved very much. But that's what I want to contest and sort of talk about a little bit in the first bit of this talk tonight, and then we'll talk about whatever we like.
Yeah, and I think just to clarify from the point of view of most of the viewers, and I include myself in this, is that everything starts in the Far East with Pearl Harbor for the Americans and kind of fall of Singapore for the British, and what we're establishing is there's actually a whole lot of stuff, albeit hush hush hush, happening before then, and you get the same in the European theatre with this phony war aspect. Well, yeah, tell that to Poland. Tell Poland there's nothing going on. So we do like to think that things start on certain dates, and actually it's often not the date things really start.
That's right, and this is wholly the case for setting up SOE in Burma. They and indeed those countries east of India under the Far Eastern Mission's remit. They get out there, and in August 1941, they've agreed. The governor of Burma and Killery have agreed on a plan for Burma by August of 1941, and part of that is what's in Killery's charter here, which I'm showing you, that we need to set up an occupation organisation in British possessions on the lines of the AUX units, home forces. And it's there in black and white. It's referencing the AUX units.
Blue on white, if I'm being picky there, but yes. In your PowerPoint, it's blue on white in your PowerPoint. I'm just being facetious. I'm making a joke. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Blue on white, not black and white. Yeah, no worries. Don't make jokes in podcasts.
It's normally me making the terrible jokes. So and also just to also reference Andrew Tatchell on the podcast the other day, he was talking about the killing off of people and the dastardly the dastardly things that the British were going to do if the Germans came. And I just had to pull this quote out and put it underneath them, that render innocuous any potential quislings. I just thought, how many ways can you...
It says what it has to say, yeah.
Yeah. All right, next slide. Yes, so that's it was episode 272 of the We Have Ways pod, I thought it was an excellent podcast, and I just wanted to respond to this idea that the Britain was the only country to prepare a resistance movement before it was needed. So you go on to the next slide. We'll have a picture of Killary. So there he is. There's Valentine St John Killary, head of SOE, and there's Sir Reginald Dorman-Smith, referred to as Dormouse-Smith by his detractors, which is also something I want to contest. What I've sort of found out about Dorman-Smith is he wanted to work around authority and get things done for the defence of Burma. He wasn't like the other colonial people in charge, like Shenton Thomas over in Malaya and Singapore, and Josiah Crosby in Siam, Thailand. I've mentioned already that Killary and Dorman-Smith met in August 1941 to organise the SOE in Burma. But it appears that they met in the UK before they went out, and they seem to have hit it off and got quite a good relationship going. And then their dates of going to the Far East, I haven't found anything to verify this, but I have an inkling that they might have sat on the aeroplane or travelled for bits of that journey out with each other. But that's something I've still yet to pin down. But it seems that these two men had a bit of a connection where Killary didn't have it with any other of the British officials in the Far East. And very quickly, he arrives to take over Burma as governor in May 1941. In August 1941, he's meeting Killary, and they are saying, "Yeah, let's do this. Let's set up a resistance movement in case the war gets to Burma." The war in Burma is not even expected by most people at that point. It's all thoughts are on Singapore, Hong Kong, and the underrated enemy, the Japanese, as they were described. So they agree. They make this agreement in August, and Brooke Popham, the commander-in-chief Far East, just said, "No, you're not doing that." He just totally scuppers their plans for setting up the organisation, and says, "Look, we need those men, we need those resources, because it's a resource-starved theatre, as well we know, and just discussed with James at the beginning of the talk at 5. And so Dorman-Smith is left in this situation. Well, okay, I'm not being allowed to by the commander-in-chief, but my colonial remit, as per the 1935 Government of India Act, which separated Burma from India and made Burma independent of India, and gave it its own legislature and elections in 1937, the same year as the elections to the Indian legislature. He had certain powers as governor he was responsible for the defence of his colony, essentially, whereas other governors weren't. So it's a sort of strange quirk of the Government of India Act. So he decides that he's going to try and continue to work around the commander-in-chief, Brooke Popham, and still get some sort of resistance movement in Burma going, despite being told not to by the top brass. And that's where we can move on to the next slide.
Yeah, and is it fair just to say, Rich, that at this time of the war, any kind of resistance organization, be it or novel, parachute troops, commandos, they are resource suckers, aren't they? You can put lots more money. A conventional infantry division costs a lot less than anything that is special and new and involves underground. They're just going to just draw in and use up supplies and resources like nothing else. So there's a bit of resistance, ironically, from the higher ups about resistance. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that they have so little to play with in any coming war with the Japanese that they just say, no, we've got to have them. We're more important than you. And in any case, Killary's a civilian. What do you know about warfare? How are you going to do anything better than we can? And also by this point, sort of 1941, there's been an experience of SOE in Europe, and they're not shining very brightly at this point.
No.
And these sort of prejudices of SOE have come across, particularly as we move into 1942 as well, with Slim's experienced SOE in the Far East. There's been all sorts of trouble with the head of SOE, Sir Frank Nelson, had to actually fly out to Cairo to resolve the squabbles that were going on and the accusations that SOE were all doing a terrible job and not achieving anything for the war effort, and sucking up resources that the military needed, the military proper. So yes, what we have there is this guy HNC Stevenson, Henry Noel Cochrane Stevenson, who's very prominent in the history of Burma, sort of pre and post Second World War. That's a picture of him in later years, taken from a newspaper, and I've put it on top of a file from the archives to show that he was given an SOE code number, which you can just see there. It's 08200, I think it is.
Right. Yep.
And this is Dorman Smith working around the prohibition of getting a stay behind party together. He says, right, you're my man. You're not SOE. You're nothing to do with the Oriental Mission. But clearly he was, because here's a file showing that he's been given a code number and he's got an SOE file. And he's tasked with forming levies throughout Burma. And they go back to this plan, and it's sort of this dual plan to have left behind parties in central Burma, which is quite politically sensitive, and it's working through the governor with UI, the home minister, to organise teams in the Delta region, southern Burma. And by February 1942, just looking at that map there, I think it's about where, just beneath the U, you've got a sort of a beginning of a teacup. Somewhere in there, you might see Prome. And from Prome, south of Prome, you've got stay behind parties organised in all the districts of the Irrawaddy Delta, and that would consist of two men who, in the records, it says they were in the know, and it was their job to organise other people to help them organise bands of, they called them toughs, who would start trying to cause havoc with the Japanese if and when they came. So that was the one scheme in central Burma. And then there's this other scheme, which would be on the frontier areas, which were mainly populated by the other ethnicities of Burma. The Kachin, the Karen are the most well known. And Stevenson himself was with the Kachin up in the north of the country. But from a place called Papun, all the way north along the border with Siam up to the north to Myitkyina, there were British officers who were with a load of rubbish Italian rifles captured in the desert and a lot of dodgy ammunition. Wow. Charged with covering these areas should the Japanese invade Burma through Siam/Thailand. So there was this nucleus of left behind parties. In Tenasserim, you've got someone called Alfred Ottaway, and he trained a load of Anglo-Burmans and Anglo-Indians. These guys have all been through STS 101, which was the special training school in Singapore that had been set up in the summer of, our summer of 1941, so after Hillary arrived. So they were trained there in August and November in all the guerrilla fighting, explosives and things at STS 101. And then they were actually in place in Tenasserim with all his mine workers, because Ottaway was in charge of a mine down in Tenasserim, a tin mine, and ready to go. Of course, the most famous left behind, of course, is Hugh Seagram, who gets a lot of airtime for his tremendous sacrifice for what he did in Burma. There's a hint that someone else stayed behind, a man called Evans. It's a little bit difficult to work out because so many files have got destroyed, and you just try and piece things together and the SOE documents in the archives are an absolute mess. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle to try and piecing it together is pretty difficult. But there's an inkling that there was another man who stayed behind as well. It wasn't just Seagram, who led quite a few attacks on the Japanese from his bases in the border area, and he was killed. But I've come to a dead end with that one, which is really quite frustrating. But yeah, there's definitely this idea that there was another British officer who stayed behind, not just Seagram. Seagram, of course, the story of Seagram's fairly well known, but he stayed there in 1942 with the Karen. He went to Papua in about the 20th of January 1942. So with his shotguns and Italian rifles, lots of Karen volunteers, about 3,000 even at this point, all thinking that they were going to help, if not cause havoc for the Japanese in one way or another, which they did appear. Again, the records are a bit sparse on this, but it appears that they did actually go into action in 1942 and attack the roads. Seagram stayed behind from 1942 right through until March 1944, when he gave himself up because the Japanese were exacting retribution on all the Karen villages, burning them down and torturing people. They knew that there were people there. They sent a huge load of Kempetai up from Rangoon, especially with DF, direction finding equipment, to try and locate the British parachutists. But because of all the torture and the scorched earth and in the search for him, he gave himself up on condition that his Karen would be spared. But the Japanese, of course, arrested 7 of his closest comrades. A few got away and took them down to Rangoon, where they were executed in September 44. And that's where he got his George Cross.
I'm sure you're going to elaborate on this later on, but the effectiveness of this mission is something obviously you've looked at, and how much impact it had, and if the Japanese are going out searching for paratroopers or parachutists, it clearly means they perceive them to be a significant threat. There's a significant danger of this presence there, and I expect most people watching this show probably were unaware of a lot of this, unless they've read your book, of course, of this aspect of behind the line stuff going on before. As I said earlier, we think of really there being anything going on in this theatre, or this country, I should specify. So I'll hand it back to you, because it's your
yes.
thing.
So 1942. If we just go to the next slide, this book, Desperate Journey, is by Arthur Leonard Bell Thompson. That's his real name. His pen name is Francis Clifford, and he writes some awesome novels. There's a couple of them based on his experience as a soldier in Burma, and but this one's his sort of account of his 900-mile hike out. He's quite remarkable. He joined SOE, got recruited into SOE, and he held up the Japanese on the road from Tongu east towards the Morchi mines, which is the way the Japanese were going to hook round and try and cut off the retreating British forces before Mandalay. And he seems to have played a significant part in slowing down, along with Noel Boyd and a few others, and Seagram and the Karens of the resistance, slowed down the Japanese advance along that road and stopping that hook getting through the Shan states to cut off the British army. So I don't think it's accurate to say that SOE allowed the Indian army, or the British army, to escape to India. There's too many other things to factor in, not least 7th Armoured Brigade and their sterling work with their tanks, and the leadership of Slim, and of course all the other sacrifices, and let's not forget the Chinese and their role in 1942 as well. But it seems that they did a significant delaying action, which may have had, in the grand scheme of things, a good enough to sort of give a bit of space.
No, I see what you're saying is you don't want to use hyperbole and make dramatic statements when they're not necessarily valid, and that's something that with history, this saved the day. We get that all the time. This thing, what you're saying is it made a difference. May not have been absolutely earth-shattering, but it's significant. Yeah. But let's not overplay it. Let's just say it made a difference.
I think it's impossible to come out with such bold statements that this is what's it'd be easy for me as an SOE, as in Burma historian, to say, yeah, great, look what SOE did. It's their fault that the army was able to retreat to India. Well, no, I don't can't go with that. They did something significant in 1942 that's been overlooked, and they did a second thing which I think is really significant, because one of the myths, or one of the things that you will automatically think when you see a map showing Japanese occupation of countries in the Far East is that the entirety of Burma was occupied by the Japanese, because all of Burma's coloured in as Japanese occupied.
Yeah.
Well, it's not true, because another group who had joined the Oriental Mission were able to demolish 5 bridges just north of Myitkyina on the road up towards Samprabum, and north of there it goes to Patau, which was known as Fort Hertz then. And the Japanese didn't advance any further. They couldn't repair the bridges, and they couldn't go up through there. Stevenson's Kachin levies had caused a bit of trouble as well. And it's that levy force that the army takes over in 1942, the end of 1942. And it's used to hold a line across the very north of Burma, which protects the hump. The Japanese are not underneath the American planes flying across the hump, flying the supplies over to the Chinese. And they've got people on the ground who can pick up the downed pilots, because the stories of the downed pilots and they're left hanging in trees, and it's horrific. You just imagine hanging in your harness on one of those massive trees, unable to get down and slowly starving to death. It's you can't imagine what those downed pilots went through. So yeah, they've got this network that's set up which saves pilots and returns downed aircrew to the Americans, which they're terribly appreciative of course. You've got radio stations in Fort Hertz, and very quickly, Operation Puddle sticks a battalion of Gurkhas into Fort Hertz to stiffen the levies and make sure that this northern part of Burma is held. And of course, this becomes very important later on with the advance into Burma. They're not. So this idea that the whole of the army is pushed out into India, marching like scarecrows, but still with their heads held high, as Slim says in Defeat into Victory. It's not just India. There is still an Allied presence in northern Burma, which I think that's
important to clarify for the audience. I know there's people, even Tim Sampson, who's Battle Maps US, who's sponsoring this week. You know, he's coming to this as an American with, he'd admit himself, limited knowledge of the Burma campaign. I think, again, you'd see in these books, the Japanese have it, and then later we had it. And what you're saying is it's much more complicated than that. And like with countries like France or Belgians, the armies may have been kicked out, but you've got this local involvement. There's resistance activity there. There's people there on the ground doing stuff for you. And I think I wanted to make that time to kind of clarify that point, that there's still active resistance in Burma, even though the Japanese are, simply because it's an enormous place of huge amounts of inhospitable terrain, down impossible areas to get to. And James said earlier on, the whole parts of it you can't get to. You still can't get to. You couldn't get to then, very easy. Now you can't get to them either. So I think it's important to understand that war isn't either or. Sometimes there's this area where Burma is still being contested. I will let you continue. That was just making my point there.
Sure. If you go on to the next slide, I've got a map on there, along with the World War One veteran Colin Hercules Mackenzie, who was in charge of the India mission. But that map it should show you sort of the very north there, and it's got an aeroplane sort of to show the hump route, and that bit of northern Burma there is never occupied by the Japanese. They try and get up to Samprabum, but they never quite make it, and they never take the Allies out of that northernmost part of Burma there. And that's, I think it's largely due to what that SOE team did, blowing up the bridges on the way. As just a little aside, Jack Bernard was one of that team who joined OSS shortly afterwards. But he talks about one of the bridges where they were sitting there in a foxhole. It was cold, and the mist had come down, and they saw a woman on the bridge dressed in white. And they later found out that there was this story about this ghost who used to frequent that bridge, and they think they saw her that night. So,
wow. No, but I love this idea of bringing in the hump, because again, the Americans who will know, they may not know about Burma, but they are more likely to know about the hump because it's much more part of the American consciousness there. And I remember meeting a pilot who flew over there years ago, and it's this connecting of the dots that I think is so important with history is understanding how this event here is having influence somewhere there, and then suddenly it connects back to a bit you do know about. And I'm sure Americans or watchers go, "Oh, that's a so they didn't know that their crews are flying over an area that isn't occupied by the Japanese." That's an important fact, I think. And so thank you for sharing that with us. So I'll hand it back to you again. I will shut up in a minute. I'm fine. I'm interested, and I'm saying what's coming to my mind.
No, you keep doing that. That's fine. That's what we're here for. Yeah, and of course, building the Lado Road would be another connection for the Americans.
Yeah,
this made that. I'm not going to say it was an easy job by any means building that damn road, but this made that fractionally easier, perhaps, shall we say, from holding that northern territory. So yeah, I just think that it's important to know that SOE did have an impact in 1942, and I think that they played a part rather than nothing, which has been the supposition up until recently.
Yeah, no, and again with SOE, we know there's a big steep learning curve, isn't it? And people who watch this, I mean, I'm talking about Europe particularly, they're thinking of the finesse of the SOE program by the time we get to 44, but there had been some really big teething problems earlier on, and we perhaps think of it in the glowing towards the end of war terms and forget that it takes a long time to get there. And I would make the point, reading what you've talked about, that actually SOE are kind of found their stride possibly earlier in the Far East than they had in the European theatre.
Yeah, and I think that's due to the men that were taken on to do it. They weren't, this idea that they were all civilians. Well, they weren't really only civilians. A lot of them are long-time Burma hands. They've been, they're acclimatized. They know the people. They speak the languages. They know how to live in these conditions, and they've joined the Burma Rifles or the Burma Frontier Force. They've as soon as war broke out in 1939, a lot of them, if they weren't already part of the Burma Defence Forces, went and joined up in 1939. Even though the war in Europe was a long way away, they still joined up. People like John Headley, who's quite a famous one with his book Jungle Fighter. He joined up straight away in 1939 and got involved with the Chindits, of course. And then after the Chindits, he came to SOE and did great things with SOE in 1945. So just a little bit about Colin Mackenzie here. Yeah, he's an interesting character. Perhaps someone who, if there's not been a biography of him, could do with one. He lost a leg in the First World War. He was good friends with the Viceroy before Wavell, Linlithgow. They were both on the board of directors of a company called J&P Coates. So he was sent out to India, with these connections to head the India mission. Sorry, I don't have a better picture of him. It's been quite hard to come by. There must be one out there somewhere, but that's the best I could do for you. So he doesn't take on any military rank. He remains a civilian, but he's got his First World War experience. But he's the only SOE commander who stays in charge of his area for the entire war. He's there from 1941 through to the end. He's the only one who survives intact in his position as a head of an SOE mission. And he absorbed the Oriental mission into his India mission in April. I think it was the 4th of April, 1942. By then the Burma campaign is all but over. They just got that last bit of walking out to do. So Oriental mission is given to him, and his remit completely changes. And he's in charge of this vast area, and has to hastily start preparing for the Japanese invasion of India. And in fact, there again, there's lots of preparation for a Japanese invasion of India in terms of SOE left behind parties and things.
Which again goes against the kind of current the conventional narrative of the British Empire being unprepared for everything. That's kind of how we think when we think of that part. And of the world, is that everything was a surprise. We had no preparation for it, and we were resoundingly beaten very quickly. And the truth is a bit more nuanced than that.
Always is, isn't it? It's always,
the interest is always in the nuance. That's what we said. As we said in the historiography shows last week, thinking nuance isn't sexy, is it? Extremes are sexy. Units have to be elite or hopeless. That's tanks have to be brilliant or useless. We don't like to sit in that area in the middle where everything is nuanced. And I like what we're doing on this channel to try and celebrate the nuance. I might think of a T-shirt with "Celebrate the Nuance" on it as a World War II TV tagline. Anyway, yes, I'll hand back to you.
Okie doke. Yeah, so he stays. He's in charge for the entire time, and I can't help but have quite a big amount of respect for him in what he did, and along with Dorman Smith as well, who I think have in some ways gone the wrong side of history, because Dorman Smith, the example of allowing Stevenson to organise the levies and things, and organise the stay-behinds, and it's not the only thing. There's other examples of what Dorman Smith did. So letting the American Volunteer Group use one of his civilian aerodromes, so that therefore they could protect the convoys with bullets in their machine guns, because it had been ruled that they weren't able to fly over Burma armed, because that might be provocative. But he made sure that the AVG had bullets in their Kitty Hawks, wasn't it? They were quick to
Kitty Hawk, or the earlier one. Was there was it War Hawks? Whatever. Yeah, Curtis. Anyway, So some remarkable personalities out there, I think, that need looking at again. Dorman Smith being one, and of course what happened to him at the end of the war and being removed from his governorship and stuff is, I think it's something waiting to be looked into a bit more. Yeah.
If we go on to the next slide, it just shows what Mackenzie's remit was now that he was in charge of all of the Far East. So it's reorganized into A, B, and C groups. Group A, Burma, Siam, French Indochina, the FIC stands for there. Group B, so it's an enormous area that he's got under his control. And if you look at those countries, what's been written about SOE in those countries, it's very, very little. There's loads of work to do on resistance and SOE and Force 136 in these areas. I quite like the idea of doing China next. Gearing up towards that at some point.
Good luck getting to those archives. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be quite a tricky one, but I think it'd be worth a go. See what they did there. So that's what the organisation was, and then you just put this in context. Right, India, they there was all these messages coming from London saying, well, "What are you doing? Why is nothing really happening?" And they're sending back maps put on other maps, just showing how big India is in terms of Europe, and saying, "Do you know how vast the distance is here?" So if you add up the distance travelled for a typical SOE agent, they've got to travel something like 4,000 miles by Indian trains to complete their training. If they're going down to Ceylon, they're doing the radio train for their jungle training. If they're going their radio training in Meerut, if they're going to Chaklala, which is in present-day Pakistan, for their parachute training. There's these huge distances just to get the men trained, and so James was saying earlier about it all comes down to logistics. The logistics have got to travel these distances too from the ports. Coming into Bombay, they've got to be transferred, and some of the things are going into Karachi and getting transported across India. That's how the Detachment 101 arrived into Karachi. They got to travel from Karachi all the way across India to get to the tea plantation in Assam, where they finally set up OSS in Nazira. And it's just these huge distances, and getting the supplies and getting the men trained, and then storage of things. Got quite fascinated, and a middle section of my book is really concerned with this. What were they up to between the defeat in Burma in 42 and going back in 1944? And the answer is it's not just reorganization for Slim and the army. It's massive reorganization for SOE, and trying to get back into the field as quickly as possible and start learning the lessons. And of course, there's a nice link to what's going on in Europe, because Europe is sort of ahead, if you like, in the war. They've got a lot to learn from what SOE have been doing in Europe. And there does seem to be some good cross-fertilization of training, and taking the sort of Bewley manual out to India to get these guys trained out there. Sorry
to interrupt you for a second. While we've got that map on there, which is showing you as the enormity of this area that they're trying to control, it may be a time to mention a question from the Great Dominion. There is, can you tell us where geographically the major centers of SOE resistance in Burma were, and how many agents would be active in a typical area and their duties? Because obviously you're throwing a small number of people in a vast area, so it's kind of, you know, grains of sand in it. So they had to focus clearly on key, very, very key areas. So maybe it wasn't in the flow of your talk, but it came up, so I thought I'd ask.
Yeah, no, that's just where we're going next. So if we put on the next slide, I'll sort of talk around that and answer that question. It's a great question. Thanks for that one, because there's lots going on. It's not this picture as I expected. Sorry. Yeah, that's just showing, you know, that Japanese one. There we are. Yeah, go on from there. Yeah, that's showing the training, which we've just been talking about.
Okay.
But the next one I wanted was this one showing the special group there. So this is where it leads. This is where they get to in 1945. Special groups that look like this. How do they get there? Very quickly, they're drawing up new plans in the wake of the defeat in Burma, and they're trying to work out how to get back into the country. And they're training agents. They're trying to get agents. They're desperate to get an agent into Rangoon, for example. They're desperate to know what's going on. They're desperate to get in touch with Seagram, or get into the Karen Hills, see if he's still alive. So there's a whole host of operations in 43 and 44, which are the build up to this where we get to with this in 1945. So you've got unfortunate stories like the two Chinese nationalist agents, Operation Wakering. Both of them somehow had a faulty parachute and died when their parachutes didn't open. Then you've got stories like the Chin radio operator, Thang Kung, who I've written about on my website. He retreated from Burma in 1942. He's recruited straight away. He's trained as a WT operator, so he does all the advanced training at Meerut, and then he goes into the Delta region, to the south west of Rangoon, to sort of send out intelligence from there. And he's working with other indigenous personnel. You've got the operations in the Arakan that really start coming to fruition from December 1944 and into 1945. But before that, they're running a lot of agents in the Arakan. So there's a lot of agents running around. There's no big parties going in, apart from Dilwyn, Operation Dilwyn and Operation Spears in sort of 1943-44. Spears is over in Kokang. Kokang is a disputed area. The Chinese really wanted it over in the northern Shan states. So as Burma sort of loops around on the eastern side, it's right up in that top right-hand corner of the northern Shan states. And that turned into more of an operation fighting against Chinese colonial ambition in Burma and making sure that they stayed out of a British possession than actually fighting the Japanese. And that got quite messy politically. There's a fascinating story just behind that one. But the major operation that had a lot of personnel, at first it was mostly Kachin and Kachin officers, but it slowly builds up into 1945 into a big operation. Is a Dilwyn operation, and that remained in the field from February 1943 right through until the end of the conflict in 1945. There was a Dilwyn presence for nearly 2 years in the area around Myitkyina and Ba Maw and Kachin land. Otherwise, it's mostly agents trying to bring back intelligence, bring agents out. So you've got people being run in from, working with 4 Corps on the Imphal front and running agents over the Chindwin and trying to bring them out, like Mong Nine Mong, who had to walk 600 kilometers from Tamu on the Indo-Burmese border and see what he could do with finding agents, see what the Burma nationalist forces were up to, and perhaps release a couple of pigeons if he could, but it appears he never did release any pigeons. And then he went down with malaria, but he managed to get back in time. So there's all these little agent stories, but what we're building to with that picture is these special groups. And that means we need to return to the Seagram story. So in 1943, they're desperate to see if Seagram's still alive and what they can do. And they finally, after a lot of hiccups, get a couple of officers into Seagram, Nemo and McCrindle, who were actually killed when the Japanese find their camp and there's a bit of a shootout. So they know that Seagram was alive at that point, and they at one point in late 1943 until March 1944, they had 3 working WT stations in the Karen Hills, as well as a couple of stations up in the Kachin lands. They're desperately still trying in the Arakan at this point. They've got agents running around, which I've written about on my website as well, but they're desperate to get someone into Rangoon, which codenamed Donkey. He doesn't get there until late 1944. But this operation to get in touch with Seagram, Operation Harlington, the Nemo and McCrindle, they get parachuted in, and they've got these 3 WT stations going, and they say, yeah, the Karen want to rise up. They're desperate still to fight. And out of that comes probably the most successful operation of SOE in the war. That's not me saying that. That's Richard Aldrich said that sometime back in his Intelligence in the War Against Japan. But it's actually remarkable, really. When 14 Army begins its advance on Rangoon, it has, and this is where the figures might startle you, because part of that question was how many people are involved. So I've talked about the single agents and things in little groups with a radio. There's the equivalent of about a division in irregular guerrillas on protecting Slim's flank as 14 Army tries to run down the country to take Rangoon before that monsoon in May 1945. So 12,000 Karen armed to the teeth. And it's not just Karen, because there's a force called P-Force who've been working on the Chindwin with 4 Corps, and this is under the command of Peacock, who was one of the special groups that goes in later. They've learned all sorts of interesting things about how the Japanese react to ambush. Apparently it's different to how the Germans would react to an ambush. The Japanese learned to fear SOE there. There's a record of them being the foe with the fearless eyes is what the Japanese were calling the guerrilla bands of SOE up on the Chindwin front. But the point is, it's not just the Karen and that 12,000 running around. It's loads of ethnic Ba Maw as well, which in the post-war history gets quite complicated because of Aung San and the mess that we still see Burma's in today, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But you've got they recruit loads of they're all listed as cultivators, which I presume is a farmer cultivating the land. And then quite a lot of these guys who are in this photo for this particular special group here, you've got Karen and Burman fighting together as officers and NCOs and riflemen and WT operators, creating merry hell on Operation Character, which is what Seagram's legacy, really, is Operation Character. And you've got somewhere in the region of 12,000 guerrillas that are recruited. That's static and mobile levies, they were called. Static stayed to protect the villages, to make sure the marauding Japanese didn't burn them down and steal all the food and rape the women and all that sort of thing. Whereas the mobile ones were mobile. They would go and set the ambushes and things. And this total complement there was probably about 80 British officers and about 30 NCOs.
Hmm.
So something like 110 men. And then if you look at the havoc they caused, well, next one, let's go to the map. The next slide is the map. So it shows you the areas. This is main areas showing where Operation Billet and Operation Character were. The blue there is Character, and then the yellow is Billet. And I think in tandem, I think we need to take these two operations in tandem and think about their strategic effect on the 45 campaign. The most significant one is it's that same road that ALB Thompson was on, holding up the Japanese advance. This is the one that's smashed by Peacock's Otter Force and prevents the Japanese from getting to Tongu to reorganize and block the advance of 14 Army. And that's seen as pretty crucial in that race for Rangoon. That if SOE hadn't done what it did on that Tongu to Morchi Road, like it had done in 1942, but in reverse in 1945, things might have been a little bit different. So that's where, you know, there's the front line there. That blue line is the front line, and that's where these teams were. To give some context to the size of the area, the blue bit there for Operation Character is about 18,000 square kilometres, which is just short of the size of Wales, and it's divided into 4 operational areas, with Walrus in the north, followed by Otter, and then Hyena, and then Mongoose. And in there as well is Ferret, which is sort of an offshoot of Otter, and that was the special group that we were just looking at, is Team Otter. And I've finally been able to name everyone in that picture, which again is was really excited to be able to do and match them to the records of Indigenous personnel that are still extant, and get that on my website as well. So that's the sort of size of the area. That's how many men there were. So imagine 80 officers and 30 NCOs with 12,000 guerrillas running around Wales, mountainous, just like the Karen hills in inverted commas, attacking your invading or your enemy forces.
And just in terms of how you put the research together for your book, and also I should put, as you mentioned yourself, the extra work there is on your website. You obviously are looking into the SOE sources as one side of things, but what is there from like 14 Army sources about any benefits they are gaining from what SOE are doing, or is there no mention? Do you have to kind of put those together yourself, or is there anything that kind of connects it?
Yeah, well, famously, Slim complained in late 1944. I'm getting nothing. All I'm getting is intelligence from the Americans about the North, and actually that was SOE, that was Dilwyn. So there was this big conference where the head of Burma section of SOE goes to meet Slim and says, "Well, actually, this is what SOE is doing. Did you know?" And he said, "I had no idea." And this, what I mentioned earlier about P Force as well, is really important because Gracie was well disposed towards SOE because of the operations there, and slowly you get trust in SOE that they know what they're doing and that they can do something worthwhile. So there's a sort of changing command structure. Slim takes on SOE and says, "Yes, okay, get your men into the Karen Hills, get your men into the Delta, raise as many indigenous forces as you can, and I'll take whatever help you give me in that race for Rangoon." There's, before that advance over the Chindwin as well, there's SOE agents being sent ahead into that immediate area in front of 14 Army to find out what's going on and bring back intelligence. So there's a post on my website where I've said about SOE operations in front of Imphal, where there is some cooperation with the army, and I think it's really important, that bit, because to me, my interpretation of it is that it's built that trust, it's built that reputation between SOE and the army, and it allows what SOE did in 1945 to happen. Slim says, "Okay, they're going to be under my control. When I give the word, that's when you start fighting." So it's something like April 13th, 45. He says up the Karens, which the Karen, sorry, which he says in Defeat into Victory. In reality, they've started before then, because there's just so much work to do right in front of them. They can't wait to get stuck in, because it's brilliant guerrilla country.
Yeah, and just I'm keeping an eye on the questions coming in. Were any SOE agents responsible for scouting and or preparing landing zones? You know, particularly those used for supplying the Chindits. Is that something they were doing?
Yes. There's a separate post on that on the website as well, so you can look at that in more detail. I've called it Stormy Relations at SOE and the Chindits. It didn't work too well for them. There's a bit of attrition between the two sides, a bit of tension between the two sides, because the Dilwyn operation that I was just mentioned prepared a drop zone, a landing zone for the Chindits, and then at the last minute, Wingate said, "No, we're not landing there," and they left the SOE men waiting on that landing ground all night, which of course you're going to get compromised quite easily if you're sitting there flashing lights all night. So there's a lot of records which show that they got pretty pissed off with the Chindits.
Well, not the only people to get pissed off with the Chindits in certain aspects, I would think. But yeah, and particularly Wingate himself, I'm guessing. But yeah, we digress, I suppose.
There's also bits where SOE, there's just mention here and there of them finding Chindits that have been left behind, some from 43, and getting them back out of Burma, where they've stayed there, they've survived somehow, and SOE come across them and get them out. So there is that too, and quite a few Chindits, of course, did join SOE afterwards, like Herring, inevitably nicknamed Fish Herring, and who I mentioned earlier, John Headley, and a few others. So they did come out of Chindits and into SOE, some of them. So it's a bit of a rocky one, because they were standing on each other's toes a bit. SOE, the Japanese reprisals were so bad after Longcloth that SOE was really wary of the second Chindit, Operation Thursday, because they said they're going to come in, they're going to stir up the hornet's nest, and then they're going to disappear. We're still going to be here, and the Japanese are going to do whatever they do to the villagers, and it'll be really hard for us to recruit them, because until they're sure that we're going to win this war, they're not going to risk their lives again. Yeah,
makes sense. Yeah.
So in fact, that does come to pass when the character teams have flown in. The first group lands, this first special group lands, and the Karen say, "Well, actually, after what's just happened, we're a bit sort of reluctant to come and fight." And then two more special groups land, and they go, "Well, there's loads of you now," but that was actually a mistake. Those two special groups were supposed to land elsewhere, but all of a sudden you've got 60, 70 odd men landing in the one place, and the Karen are going, "Right, yeah, you're serious this time." Yeah, the tide of war is turning. So yeah, a bit of crossover with Chindits.
Okay, well, we should move on. So who?
Yeah, I just thought I'd put an example of some of the recruits. 20 years old, 36-year-old, 35 years old, all named as cultivators. These are the men that SOE are recruiting on the ground that go in and get trained on the ground. Well, these ones actually got trained in a lot of them. The records that exist are for ones who actually made it to India to get trained, or were picked up by P-Force and taken back into India and trained. Where the records don't exist is for most of that 12,000 who were recruited when those special groups went in. But these are some of the guys that were recruited. And the next one just shows you the stats for Operation Character, which are they called it the game book, as in keeping a record of your stags and your pheasant and your grouse. This was keeping a record of your Japanese instead. And there you've got the names of the different character groups, how many they reckon they killed, wounded, how many they captured, and for their own. And you work out that ratio, and 11,874 for 22 is pretty good by anyone's reckoning.
Yeah, and that that seemingly boring as stats can sometimes seem, that is incredible. That data, they are more that, as you said, they're more than, meeting their, I can't think of the words now. They are taking way more than they are losing, which is in war is, you do that, you win the wars, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah. We'll move on.
Yeah. All I put on next was a load of photos from Sergeant Roger Laney, shared with me by his son Simon Laney. So these are pictures taken from Mongoose Operation Character, where Sergeant Laney was a WT operator. And I just think these are amazing pictures. These are the Karens on parade after the surrender, and at an airfield that they made called Bolo Ork. And yeah, you can see all the Bren guns on that one. And if you just flick through,
we're still trying to turn them into mini Brits, aren't we? You're still, trousers pressed, berets on. It's that we can't just let them be who they are. We still have to try to, come on, lads, come on. Parade grounds. It's amazing to see, but there's a little bit of a, come on, lads, become British.
Some officers were certainly like that, and others weren't. But this is the victory parade. This is where it looks like they go on the parade ground as well drilled British soldiers. There's a collection of a weapons hall that they've brought in. That's all Japanese weapons. This one's from the National Archives, and that's a train that's been blown up by Major Lucas, apparently, but there's some doubt about that I've discovered.
Okay. Is that on your website?
No, this is something fairly recent that I've read about, and it's my latest postal website. I called it Difficult History, and there's perhaps some difficult things here which might upset family members. So you don't really, got to be a bit sensitive. And there's Peacock with his levies in the Otter area.
Yeah, wonderful.
Japanese, also from the National Archives. That's on the Tongu Mochi Road. You can see how it's only a few short weeks later, and the jungle's reclaiming it. There's Peacock there with his top off, and others.
Yeah,
there's the Viceroy's commissioned officers of Otter. Captured Japanese tanks and things. Okay, all those ones with the writing on from HS 7107, the National Archives. And those are photos of the photos.
So when we kind of bring things to an end fairly soon. So you're very careful about not bigging up too much. You kind of, I sense you like to be rooted in what you can absolutely definitively say, and you don't want to get in this hyperbole and exaggeration, what have you. But clearly you've got a real connection and affinity for the SOE now. So kind of, I'm putting you on the spot now. How would you describe what they managed to achieve? Kind of break it down to something kind of simple, and big it up a bit. Clearly they were significant. So explain what you think the results they achieved.
Well, I can't help but just think, wow, what these guys did. The terrain that they're traversing, where it takes the best part of a day to travel sort of 5 miles as the crow flies, because you've got to go up and down, and the lack of supplies, the whinging about the supplies that they were getting, so the conditions in which they were operating, that far behind the lines. Some of them, the indigenous agents, they've the individual stories of the indigenous agents, the Chins that went in, the Ba Maw that went in, the Gurkha who went in, and then the Chinese agent Li Jui who went in. It's not always a success story in terms of what they managed to do, but what they managed to do was remarkable in itself, and just so crazy brave and selfless. You just can't help but respect it. And in terms of the wider campaign, I do think that they played a significant part in the reclamation of Burma in 1945. When you've got a division marauding on your flank, and you've got another massive operation right in front of you, but behind the enemy lines, blocking the Japanese resupply up through central Burma towards Mike Tiller. It's got to have some strategic effect, hasn't it? The easiest way, I suppose, to think about it would be take them out. How well would 14 Army have done without SOE there? I think they were very successful. I think they learned a lot that period between the defeat in 42, all those getting back in Burma operations of 43 and 44. When you get to the stats, like they're supplying 15 Corps with 80% of its intelligence, they did have strategic effect. I'm sure of that. They played a significant part in that campaign, and that's something that more widely SOE has been said, it's just a waste of time. It didn't do anything in France. It didn't assist with the D-Day landings. SOE was, but if you're going to give a judgment on SOE as a whole, I think you need to know about what SOE did everywhere. You've got to judge the whole organisation to come up with a whole generalisation of how effective the organisation was.
Yeah.
You can come up with a judgment and say, okay, this is what they did in Europe, this is what they did in Burma. But then you need to put those parts together and say, well, was this organisation a significant part of World War II for the British and their allies?
But we're in an era where we measure significance by dramatic results, because that's what sells. And sometimes the reality is there isn't this massive, great, dramatic war-winning thing. It's all about a jigsaw puzzle of many pieces. And when you're looking at something like the Burma campaign, as we are in Burma Week, it's all of these things coming together. It's intelligence, it's the Americans over the hump, it's what the SOE are doing, and then it's Slim's leadership, it's the Chindits doing what they're doing to varying levels of success, and trying to find one thing as being my God, that's the thing that won the battle. That's popular history, not real history. And SOE has a part that's important, but let's not take it beyond what it is. It's part of a successful campaign, and I think you've admirably demonstrated it. The learning curve there from kind of improvising something and then going back and actually providing a flanking divisional sized force to aid the 14th Army is significant.
It's remarkable stuff.
So we had just a question there, one last one about the great you in there about the Lysander on the cover of your photo and book and how they were used there. And he's just saying, were they essentially used in the same way in Burma as they were in Northwest Europe?
Again, I've written something specifically about the Lysander because the Lizzie did such sterling work in Burma. It didn't get a place in my book. So that they're used to fly in agents, officers they don't arrive till fairly late, so they I don't think actually they put in any agents, but they were used to fly in officer replacements, used to fly out casualties. They were used on ammo drops when SOE was up against it, because after Rangoon was taken, the army sort of sat back and thought, all right, okay, Operation Zipper, let's go for Malaya next. I think that really shows how important it was that the army and SOE were working in tandem, because as soon as the army relaxed, SOE start getting pummeled by the Japanese. And they have a couple of really close shaves where Spitfires and Lysanders are free dropping ammunition down onto the guys on the ground, so they can literally stick it in their weapons and fight off the Japanese attacks on their positions. They were used at the end of the war. The Australian War Memorial website has got a nice picture of Japanese officers getting into a Lizzie to go in and start trying to convince the Japanese that the war's over. So they had a huge role in theatre, in Burma.
Cool. And final question really is where next for you with your research? What's next? Is it sticking in Burma, sticking with SOE? Is it the theatre that attracts you? Is it SOE that what next for you?
I feel incredibly tied to Burma. I've invested a lot of my life in Burma, and there's so much more to do with it. There's so many interesting bits. Which, just as I find them and as I read them, and so I put myself down as sort of a full-time teacher, a part-time Burma academic. And so when I've got a moment, we're not doing up the new house, and I try to put out a post per month on my website of new stuff that I found from the records. So there's a few things to follow. I'm trying to get an oral history published at the moment, and I really need to sort of get that finished. It's been going on for a long time now, and this is translated accounts from the Karen of their experience of pre-World War II, during World War II, whether they were in SOE or not, whatever unit they were in, and then post-World War II as well. So there's quite an interesting load of translated oral testimonies there, which I'm hoping to get out sooner rather than later. I also want to sort of take all the bits I put on my website, work on them properly, and organise them into a book. But the next big project, as I say, I've really got my eye on doing SOE in China. I think that would be an interesting one to do. It's going to be a tricky one to do, but I think it's the one we know virtually nothing about.
Yeah. Well, good luck with that, because I mean,
it's
all going to add this to our pantheon of knowledge, because that's the issue is that the big popular histories talk about the big overviews, but there's all these, I'm not going to use the word niche, but there's these more specialized, focused studies that are so important. And it's one of the things I'm really proud of here on World War II TV, is giving someone like yourself an opportunity, even in a kind of, we're not big, but to go in, hone in on something that's quite small. But that's, the BBC Channel 5 would never do that. They'd give you 2 minutes on a show if they were lucky. It's not because they're doing the wrong thing. It's just they're doing a different thing. We have time to go into a level of detail that's greater. So anyway, it's been brilliant talking to you, Richard. And
thank you so much.
And talk about SOE in China when you finish that work there, unless you're kind of going to be connecting from some Chinese cell somewhere because you've been arrested for going and looking in archives you shouldn't be going into. We'll see, but I'll send you a parcel with a file in it or something. Anyway, that was great, Richard. Rich. So in terms of for those watching, of course, this is our two shows on Burma Today. Tomorrow it's Tony Wedding with Chindits, and we carry on with Lucy and Hill 170 and Robert and Slim and Wingit and everything, and Tim about the Gurkhas, and finally John with Merrill's Marauder. So there's lots more to come. I'm sure there'll be lots more discussions and lots more discussions on Twitter as well. As usual, links below to Richard's book, to Richard's website, to Patreon, to how you can contact me and him and others via Twitter and social media. It remains for me to say thank you to Rich for joining us. Thank you to everybody else for watching, and we will see you again tomorrow for Chindits. So thanks for watching. I'll end the stream now. It's been great fun. I'm Paul Woodadge. This is World War II TV.